Alright everyone, new project time. I got these plastic tombstones all clipped out. I got some rectangles of MDF I filed and sanded. Let's take these and let's make something. Hello everyone, I am Destro, and you're watching Realm of the Lich King. In this episode I'm going to be making a couple of spooky graveyards, one of them with a old dead tree, so I have an opportunity to show off how I'm making those. I make my armatures first, using a bit of wiring cable that I picked up from the hardware store. Just, cut off the plastic sheath and twist some of those wires together to make little branches. I do the same thing for all of them, get a bunch of branches in shapes that I like, and then once those are done, do the same thing for the roots. For the bases this time, I'm going to be using this sort of fast mache, instant paper mache stuff I found at the hobby store. Not entirely sure what this stuff is. I think it's basically the same as Sculptamold, but you just add water and you get this sort of goopy ball of fibrous putty. I'm using gloves because I don't particularly want this on my hands. And then I just take that and spread it all over the bases in a big sort of mound to make some nice earth texture for us to work from here. Takes a little while, but once it's done, you got a nice bit of texture to build a base up from, and you're not gonna have... It's not gonna look flat, I think is mostly the thing. You don't want it to look too flat. Especially since I'm doing a graveyard here, so after I've got it all spread out, I came in a little bit and sort of, pushed down in some places and made these little mounds that'll work well to put gravestones in front of. Once I had my textures all sorted out, I test fitted where the tree was going to go to make sure that there wouldn't be any, grave mounds underneath the tree, and then I started pushing gravestones down into the putty. I didn't think this was going to hold super well, and indeed it did not, but pushing these in while the material is not cured yet does allow you to come back in and superglue them later, and you have a dedicated spot for them. It just looks better to make a little indentation for the stones to fit in before you glue them all down later than it does trying to glue them on top of cured paper mache, essentially. Alright, so... onwards to the tree itself. I've got some milliput here, and mixed all this stuff up. Milliput isn't very fun to work with. It's kind of sticky and weird, and I'm not a huge fan of milliput, but it is good for being a cheap putty that I can cover a tree armature in. Nice two-part epoxy, get that all squished down onto the branches, give them a little bit more thickness than just the wire. Again, this is a process. It does take a little bit to do, but I'm only doing one tree here, and it's not that long. Of course, this isn't going to be enough on its own. I am going to have to do some more to this to make it look like a tree, but it's not all that difficult. Nice, simple process. Don't forget the roots. Of course, got to get putty on those. And there we go. Tree's all puttied up and sort of sitting in place. You can see that it's got some space underneath it, and I do need to fill that in with some green stuff to make the tree sit down in place, but I'm okay with putting green stuff underneath the tree. And I'm okay with super gluing these gravestones down afterwards. If I hadn't done this, they'd be very, very easy to knock off. The Sculptamold stuff doesn't have a very strong hold to it once it's dry. It is not glue. Oh, right, yeah, we got these, we got some little pewter crows, ravens actually, from Bad Squiddo Games is where I purchased these. And I'm going to be putting a link to the description in that if you want to check them out for yourself. They're neat little figures, they come in packs of 8, and they can really add the extra bit of detail to your builds. I've decided to put 3 of them onto the tree here, pinned them in place, drilled through the milliput, and there we go, 3 little ravens sitting in a tree. Had to put some green stuff around them. They do come with little sculpted bases on them in order to, have their little bird feet gripping onto something. And I had to cover those up with green stuff a little bit just to get them to sit in place. Now, this artist's crackle paste is how I do tree bark for my dead tree. I just cover the whole armature in crackle paste. Takes a little bit to dry, but once it's dry, you should have a few nice little sort of cracklings and bark texture in there. It looks pretty good as long as you sort of dab it on. Even if it doesn't crackle, you can see here that it's a decent texture in and of itself. Onto the basing, I needed to use some sand to cover up the bits that hadn't got the fast mesh on it. It did warp the MDF a little bit, unfortunately, but that's just gonna happen. So, sprinkling sand on this, tedious and messy process, long process, and you kind of get sand everywhere. It's what sand does. While we're here, let's talk a little bit about the Mortal Realms, the setting for Age of Sigmar. The Mortal Realms were formed out of the world that was, which is what GW has been referring to as the Old World, Warhammer. When Sigmar escaped the death of the Old World, he was rescued by Dracotheon the Great Drake. The cosmic god beast carried Sigmar through the blackness of the void, leading him to several spheres of crystallized magic hanging in the Great Dark. Each of these realms was a separate plane of reality, vast and ancient beyond comprehension. Within their seemingly endless expanse, he found primitive tribes and other gods, such as himself, lost and alone. Sigmar roused the gods and led them to claim dominion over the realms. The immortal will of these beings gave new shape to the realms, though each plane has forever remained an incarnation of magic, a separate expression of the fundamental forces of existence. Ancient portals known as realm gates connect the 8 realms to one another, and also join locations within each realm. These passages bridge the void between worlds, allowing intrepid adventurers and conquering armies to travel between and across them. Breaking from the lore for a second, realized after I'd primed this, maybe not Mod Podging it first was a mistake. It was lifting up and tearing, and eventually I ended up just kind of mashing it around to get the baking soda to stay stuck down. Hindsight's 20/20, you know? Anyways, after that was done, I did a quick paint on the tree, because I wanted to Mod Podge that later. Charred brown, wildwood, and brown sand, and then done. Back to the lore. Now, the specific realm that I'm dealing with here is probably going to be, of course, Shyish, the Realm of Death. I've talked a little bit about that in the Mausoleum video, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. Shyish, the Realm of Death, is a place of endings, home to every underworld ever dreamed into being by the collective faith and superstition of mortal kind. Here, the dead walk amongst the living, and both forge a precarious existence from the harsh and unforgiving land. Though Sigmar has established several outposts in the realm, most notably the city of Glim's Forge in the Zerkona Desert, Nagash considers the Realm of Death his by right. The great necromancer's baleful influence is steadily twisting Shyish into a sterile empire populated by malicious undead creatures. So that's what we're dealing with here. The Amethyst Realm is home to Nagash, the great necromancer, who is one of the surviving characters from the Warhammer Old World, and also home to the Amethyst Wind, the Wind of Death, where death magic comes from. Again, that's why these are painted purple. For the ground between the gravestones, after I had base coated and dry brushed them, I started out originally using just a pure Liquitex black ink, but this was a little too dark. I didn't really like the way it was looking, and eventually I had to go back and mix in a bunch of flow aid and thinner and all kinds of stuff to get the ink to really thin down and not sort of just cover over all my nice dry brushing completely. You can see even at the front here that it was too dark at the front, and I had to go over the brown on the gravestones with a little bit of a dry brush and really just kind of redo that whole thing. I wasn't happy with it, but, lesson learned, right? Did a bit of quick work on the details, green for the vines on this one headstone, and painted metallics for the shovel and the lantern, and then it was on to crows. I ended up starting these guys from a base coat of gray. This is a little bit lighter than the gray primer that I had on them, but I just kind of left some of that in the recesses, so there would be a little bit of shadow. You don't want to paint crows pure black, because then they'll look pure black. You need a bit of visual interest in there. I did want the black to be slightly blue toned, so I used Glacier Blue as my sort of off-white for my dry brush highlights here. And then after I was done with that, I brought it all back down with a little bit of contrast paint. These ravens are textured quite nicely, so the contrast took to them well, filling in the gaps and recesses between their feathers. I kind of figured this would be the case, that's why I picked the contrast. That did bring the highlights down a little bit too much though, so I had to come back with a mix of Glacier Blue and Dark Grey. I had originally tried just pure Glacier Blue, but it was too bright. I went with the mix, just to tone it down a little bit so that they wouldn't be too bright. I wanted these guys to be a point of interest, but not exactly a focal point. So I didn't want the highlights to be too stark. I think this was a nice compromise. And, of course, Vallejo Vermilion, which is one of my new favorite colors, using that to fill in some little red eyes on the crows. Crows don't have red eyes, but these are shyish crows. They can be different. They were also the last thing I needed to actually paint. A little bit of Mod Podge to seal in all the sand, and that brings an end to a project on which absolutely nothing went wrong. Ah, Jesus. Nobody saw that. Nobody saw that. Nobody saw it. Don't worry about it. That's right, absolutely nothing. But that is the end of the project, and moving on through the shots of the finished thing here, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a quick, fun little project, just to add a nice little bit of visual interest scatter-type terrain. I think it turned out pretty well in the end, despite a few mistakes and tactical errors along the way. Links will be in the description to Bad Squiddo Games, where I bought the crows that I used for this project, and to Renedra Generics, which is the company responsible for the tombstones I used on this project. Once again, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching and for joining me here on Realm of the Lich King. It really does support the channel. If you would like to more directly support the channel, I am going to be setting up a Ko-fi account, and I'm going to put a link to that down in the description as well. But for now, thanks again, see you next time.